First story, the scarecrow. There's something about Kansas nights. The wind picks up a peculiar howl once the sun dips beneath the horizon, making the fields sway like restless waves. You'd think, living here my whole life, I'd be used to it. But that night felt different, like the wind wasn't alone, like it was dragging something along with it. My family's farm isn't much. Acres of corn that stretch further than the eye can see, an old barn that creaks no matter how many times we fix it, and that damn scarecrow. It's been out there longer than I've been alive. My grandfather put it up, and since then, no one's bothered to move it. No one's had to. It did its job, I guess. Kept the crows away, or maybe it was just an old superstition. Either way, I never paid much attention to it. Not until that night. The storm had been brewing for hours, and when it hit hard. Thunder cracked so loud it shook the house, and the rain came down in sheets, thick and cold. Couldn't sleep. Something gnawed at the edges of my mind, something I couldn't quite place. Restless, I looked out my bedroom window towards the field, and that's when I saw it, the scarecrow standing there, but closer. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was a trick of the rain, but no, it was closer, standing maybe 100 yards from the house, far from its usual spot in the middle of the field. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the wind had knocked it over and someone had moved it, or maybe it was never that far away in the first place. I decided to check it out in the morning, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when the storm cleared and the morning came, the scarecrow wasn't where it should have been. It was even closer, 20 yards closer. I stood there on the porch, staring at it, the sun warm on my back, but my blood ran cold. How could that be? I walked out to the field, my boots squelching in the mud, and there it was. Same old ragged clothes, straw poking out from its wrists, burlap sack stitched together for a face. It stared back at me with that crooked smile someone had sewn on years ago. Its arms were still outstretched, crucifix-like, but something about its posture looked wrong. It was too stiff, too upright, too real. I grabbed the post it was stuck on and yanked it out of the ground. It was heavier than I expected. The wood splintered in my grip. I dragged it back to the center of the field, shoving it deep into the soil, forcing it to stand where it belonged. With one last glance, I turned and headed back to the house. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that damn smile, that burlap face, as if it was still staring at me through the window. I eventually fell asleep, but the peace didn't last. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was look out the window. I wish I hadn't. The scarecrow was closer again, now less than 50 yards from the house. My stomach twisted. I'd moved it myself. There was no wind last night, no storm. Nothing could have dragged it back. My heart raced as I threw on my boots and ran outside. Standing there, staring at it, I felt like I was losing my mind. Its posture had shifted again, and I swear the face looked different. The stitches weren't as crooked. The eyes seemed more focused, more deliberate. I wasn't sleeping. That had to be it. I wasn't sleeping, and my brain was screwing with me. I grabbed a match and some lighter fluid from the barn, determined to end whatever sick joke this was. The scarecrow didn't burn easy. The straw caught quick enough, but the wooden frame was stubborn. I stood there in the field, watching as the flames consumed it, the heat warming my face even as my skin crawled with unease. As the fire crackled and the smell of burning straw filled the air, I felt a brief sense of relief. But by nightfall, the relief was gone. Around midnight, I heard it. Soft at first, just a whisper of movement, like the sound of fabric dragging across the ground. I told myself it was the wind, but when I looked out the window, there was no mistaking it. The scarecrow was back, and it was standing just outside the fence. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt the cold grip of fear clawing up my spine. How? I had burned it. I had watched it burn. Yet there it was, standing closer than ever before. Its posture had changed again. Its arms hung lower, the shoulders more relaxed. Almost human. I backed away from the window, trying to catch my breath, trying to convince myself this wasn't happening. But the sound continued, closer now. Footsteps, deliberate, slow. I ran downstairs, grabbing the first thing I could, a kitchen knife, and headed for the front door. I wasn't going to stay in that house another second. But as I reached for the doorknob, the footsteps stopped. The house was silent, too silent. Then I felt it, cold, bony hand on my shoulder. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There it was, not outside, not in the field. Right behind me, its burlap face inches from mine, its empty eyes staring through me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The last thing I saw was its twisted grin. They found me the next morning, hanging in the field where the scarecrow once stood, my arms outstretched, my face blank. Just another part of the farm. And the scarecrow? It was gone. Or maybe it never was a scarecrow at all. Second story, the barn house. When my wife, Emily, and I bought that rundown farm in rural Texas, it felt like a dream come true. The property was vast, the land fertile, and the house, though old and battered, had the kind of charm that made you want to roll up your sleeves and get to work. Our plan was simple: renovate the house, turn it into a quaint bed and breakfast, and spend our days enjoying the quiet life away from the bustle of the city. Everything about it seemed perfect except for the barn. The locals were quick to offer advice when we moved in, telling us to be careful of the heat, of the snakes, of the isolation. But whenever we mentioned the barn at the far end of our property, their faces changed. They'd go quiet, and more than once I caught them glancing nervously toward it. "That barn's got a bad history," one of the older men at the hardware store said. "You might want to stay clear of it." At first, we thought it was just small-town superstition, some old ghost story to keep kids from playing around dangerous structures. The barn was massive, easily the oldest building on the property, its weathered wooden planks gray with age. It leaned slightly, like it was tired of standing after all these years. The big sliding door was rusted and crooked, with vines creeping up its side. From the outside, it didn't look particularly inviting, but cursed? That seemed a bit dramatic. But that night changed everything. It was a little past midnight when I heard it. The sound of metal grinding against metal, long and slow, like someone dragging a shovel across stone. Emily was already asleep beside me, but the noise was too loud, too distinct to ignore. I slipped out of bed and went to the window. The moon hung low in the sky, casting the barn in shadows. From the distance, it looked like a hulking silhouette, black against the silver glow of the night. Then the sound came again, clearer this time. It was coming from the barn. Curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight, pulled on my boots, and headed out into the night. The cool air felt refreshing against my skin, but as I neared the barn, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but something felt off. The closer I got, the thicker the air seemed to become, heavy and almost suffocating. The smell of rust and decay hit me as I reached the barn door. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open, the old wood groaning under my touch. Inside, the beam from my flashlight cut through the thick dust that swirled in the air. The barn was filled with old, rusted tools, plows, scythes, chains, things that hadn't been used in decades. Everything was covered in a layer of grime, untouched by time, but there was no sign of anyone, no reason for that noise. Yet the air inside felt wrong, stale, thick, like it was pressing down on me. I walked further in, the floor creaking beneath my feet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though when I turned to look behind me, there was nothing, just shadows. I stayed for a few more minutes, shining my light around, but the oppressive weight in the air was too much. I had to get out. The next few days, things only got worse. I started having nightmares. Each one was the same. I was inside the barn, but not alone. Someone was trapped there with me. I couldn't see it, not clearly, but I could feel it moving in the shadows, crawling just out of sight. In the dreams, I could hear it scratching at the walls, desperate to get out. Each time I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, unable to shake the feeling of cold, unseen eyes watching me. Emily noticed. She told me I looked pale, like I hadn't slept in days, which wasn't far from the truth. But I didn't want to worry her. It was just stress, I told myself. The pressure of fixing up the house, getting everything ready for our new life. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Then I found the trapdoor. It was 2 weeks after the first night in the barn, and I couldn't stay away. Something about that place drew me back, even though I hated every second of being inside. I was walking around the perimeter of the barn, looking for any reason to explain the noise, the nightmares, when my foot caught on something. A loose board. I pried it up, and underneath was a door, small and almost hidden. A trapdoor. I shouldn't have opened it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave it alone, to close the barn and never come back. But I couldn't. My hands moved on their own, pulling the door open, revealing a small, dark room below. The stench of mold and rot hit me immediately, making me gag. But I climbed down. The room was no larger than a closet, with walls of dirt and stone. But it wasn't the size or the smell that made my skin crawl. It was the marks, deep, jagged claw marks, scratched into every surface of the walls. Something had been kept down here. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when I heard it, soft at first but growing louder. A scratching sound, like nails on stone. I scrambled up the ladder, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the top, but before I could pull myself out, the barn door slammed shut behind me. The air around me grew colder, and I felt it. Something standing right behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel its presence looming, watching. I bolted out of the barn, but as I ran, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud. I heard the lock click, as if something or someone had sealed it from the outside. I ran back to the house, shaking, but when I got inside, I couldn't bring myself to explain to Emily what I'd found. The fear had wrapped itself around my throat, choking the words before they could come out. The next morning, Emily woke up to find the barn locked and empty. I was gone. No one ever figured out where I went or why the barn was locked from the outside that night. But the townsfolk, the ones who told me to stay away, they knew. They always knew. Now they tell Emily to sell the place, to move far away before the barn decides it's ready for another visitor. Third story, the whispers in the cornfield. Moving to Iowa wasn't part of the plan, but life has a funny way of throwing things at you when you least expect it. After my divorce, Emily and I needed a fresh start. And when I found out we'd inherited an old family farmhouse from a distant relative I barely remembered, it felt like fate. A new beginning, just me, my daughter, and the wide open fields. The drive out to the farmhouse was long, the roads narrowing until we were surrounded by miles of nothing but endless cornfields. The house sat at the edge of one of these fields, looking worn and tired, but still sturdy. It was peaceful, though, and that's what we needed. First, everything was fine. The house was old, sure, but it had character. Emily seemed to like it, too, spending hours running around the yard, exploring. The cornfield stretched out behind the house like a wall of green, its tall stalks swaying gently in the wind. It was about a week after we moved in that Emily first mentioned the whispers. "Mommy," she said one evening as I was unpacking some boxes in the kitchen, "the people in the corn are talking to me." I looked up, frowning. "What people, honey?" "The people who live in the corn," she said, her voice so casual, like she was telling me what she had for breakfast. "They call my name. They want me to come play." I smiled, brushing it off as her imagination. Moving to a new place can be tough on a kid, and I figured she was just making up stories to cope. "Well, Tell them it's time for dinner, and they can wait until tomorrow, I said, trying to keep it light. Emily giggled and went back to her toys, and I didn't think much more of it. But later that night, after I tucked her into bed and settled down with a book, I heard it too. It was faint, almost like the rustling of the corn in the wind, but underneath that sound was something else. Something human. It was hard to describe, but it felt like the whispers were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sarah, I froze, the hair on my neck standing on end. I must have imagined it. The house was old, after all. Houses like this creaked and groaned, especially at night. That's what I told myself. But the next day, Emily mentioned the voices again. They asked me to come to the cornfield last night, she said at breakfast, her tone matter-of-fact. But I told them I wasn't allowed to go after dark. I put down my coffee, trying to keep my voice calm. Emily, there's no one in the cornfield. It's just us here. Okay? No more talking about voices. They're not real. She looked up at me, her blue eyes wide and innocent. But Mommy, they said your name too. I laughed it off, but inside, I felt a cold knot of fear forming in my stomach. That night, I locked all the doors and made sure Emily stayed inside. But the whispers continued, louder now, clearer. Sarah, come to us. We're waiting. I could hear them from the back door, whispering through the corn. I stood there, staring out into the darkness, my pulse racing. The rustling of the corn seemed to move in waves, as if someone was pushing through the rows, waiting just beyond the reach of the porch light. For the first time, I felt truly afraid. This wasn't just Emily's imagination. Something was out there. The next few days were worse. Emily became quieter, more distant. She would sit by the window for hours, staring at the cornfield, like she was waiting for something. I kept her inside as much as I could, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling her toward the field. And every night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Sarah, come to us. She belongs to us now. Then, one evening, Emily disappeared. I had only turned my back for a second. I was cooking dinner, and when I looked up, she was gone. Panic hit me like a freight train. I ran through the house, calling her name, searching every room, every corner. Nothing. And then I heard it, the whispers drifting in from the cornfield. She's here, Sarah. She's waiting. I grabbed a flashlight and ran out the back door, my heart pounding. The corn towered over me as I pushed through the stalks, the dry leaves scratching at my skin. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until the only light came from my trembling flashlight. Emily! I screamed, my voice cracking. Where are you? And then I saw it. A faint glow up ahead, deep in the heart of the field. I moved toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the whispers growing louder with each step. Finally, I broke through into a small clearing, and my heart stopped. There, in the middle of the clearing, stood Emily. But she wasn't alone. Surrounding her were figures. At first, I thought they were just scarecrows, crudely made, dressed in tattered clothes, their bodies stiff and unnatural. But as I stepped closer, I realized with horror that they weren't made of straw and wood. They were made of bones, human bones, bound together with old ropes and bits of cloth, their hollow eyes staring out from beneath straw hats. And Emily, she was just standing there, her eyes wide and blank, staring at nothing. Emily? I whispered, stepping toward her, my hands shaking. Sweetie, we need to go. We need to get out of here. She didn't move, didn't even blink. It was like she was in a trance. Then, as I reached out to grab her, the whispers surged around me, almost deafening. She's ours now, and you will be too. Suddenly, Emily turned to face me. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now dark, empty, like she was no longer my daughter but something else entirely, something cold. I pulled her toward me, desperate to get her out of there, but the corn seemed to close in around us. the stalks twisting and bending, trapping us in that nightmarish clearing. The whispers were all I could hear now, swirling around me, drowning out my thoughts. I looked down at Emily, my heart breaking. Her face had changed, her expression cold and emotionless, like she was no longer there. "We need to go," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. But she just stared at me with those empty eyes and whispered back, "We can't leave, Mommy. They won't let us." The figures around us seemed to shift, their bony arms outstretched toward us, pulling us into their eternal grip. And that's when I knew the whispers weren't calling us out of the cornfield. They were calling us in. No one ever leaves once the whispers begin. And now Emily and I were part of it too. The field is always waiting. Fourth story, the rooster's song. I've lived on this farm in Tennessee my whole life. It's a simple existence, but it's mine. The land, the animals, the rhythm of the day, sunrise to sunset. It's all I've ever known. The mornings used to be my favorite, waking up to the crow of my old rooster, just like my father and his father before him. That sound marked the start of a new day, the familiar routine of chores, feeding the livestock, tending to the fields. Until recently, the rooster started crowing at midnight. The first time it happened, I figured maybe he was confused. A storm was rolling in, clouds thick and heavy, and the moon barely showed. The weather can mess with animals sometimes, so I shrugged it off, pulled the blanket over my head, and went back to sleep. But the next night, it happened again. Midnight, clear as a bell, that rooster let out a piercing crow that jolted me awake. I glanced at the clock, 12 on the dot. Too early for the morning, too late for anything else. My heart pounded, and I lay there for a while, listening to the eerie quiet that followed. Then, from somewhere deep in the pasture, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of a deer or the scampering of raccoons, but heavy, deliberate. They moved slowly, like something was prowling through my fields, something bigger than anything I'd ever dealt with. I pulled on my boots and grabbed the flashlight, stepping outside into the thick night air. The beam of the light barely cut through the darkness, and the silence was suffocating. No crickets, no wind, not even the usual rustling of leaves. Just those heavy footsteps, fading into the distance. But nothing, no sign of movement. The cattle were restless, shuffling around in the barn, but otherwise, everything seemed normal. I chalked it up to the wind and my nerves getting the better of me. Yet, that sinking feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. For the next week, the rooster crowed at midnight, like clockwork. Every single night, the sound tore through the stillness, and every night, I heard those footsteps. It became a routine, only now it wasn't one I welcomed. The cows and sheep started acting strange, too, more skittish than usual. Some mornings, I'd find them huddled together in the far corners of the pasture, their eyes wide and their breathing quick, like something had been chasing them. Then they started disappearing. First, it was just a few sheep. I figured it might have been coyotes or a stray dog, but there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks. They were just gone. And then the cows, big, sturdy animals, vanished without a trace. Whatever was taking them was doing it quietly and cleanly, too cleanly. By the second week, the rooster's midnight crow had become a grim signal, a warning. Each time he crowed, something stirred in the dark, something unseen but present. The heavy footsteps grew louder, closer. I tried to track the sounds, circling the property at night with my flashlight and shotgun, but no matter how close they seemed, I never found a source. The animals kept vanishing, one by one, and every morning, the empty barn felt like a graveyard. One night, after a particularly long day of searching for the latest missing sheep, I finally decided enough was enough. No more sitting around and waiting. If something was out there, I was going to find it, and I wasn't going to let it take another one of my animals. It was a moonless night, the sky black and starless. Even the air felt different, thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath. Midnight came, and with it the rooster's crow. The sound was sharper than usual, like it was cutting through the darkness itself. I grabbed my shotgun and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, but this time they were closer. Too close. I made my way toward the barn, the beam from my flashlight shaky in my trembling hand. As I approached, something caught my eye. Footprints. Huge, inhuman prints pressed deep into the dirt around the barn. They weren't from any animal I knew. The shape was wrong, almost like a bird's talon, but far too large. Larger than anything that should have been on my property. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the overwhelming urge to turn back, to get inside and lock the doors, to forget what I'd seen. But then, from the shadows, I heard it, the heavy breathing. Deep, guttural, like something huge was lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I swung the light toward the barn, my pulse racing, and there, emerging from the shadows, I saw it. At first, I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. It was massive, towering over the barn, its body hunched and twisted, feathers matted with mud and something darker. Its eyes, glowing empty, were fixed on me, and its beak, no, its face. Its face was half-human, grotesque and deformed, but with sharp, bird-like features. And then I realized, with a sickening jolt of horror, that it wasn't just any creature. It was my rooster, or at least what was left of it. The thing let out a screech, a high-pitched, grating sound that rattled my bones. It spread its massive wings, twisted and ragged, as if it had been torn apart and pieced back together in some horrific, unnatural way. I stumbled backward, raising my shotgun, but my hands were shaking too hard. The creature's massive talons dug into the earth as it took a step toward me, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. I fired, the shot echoing through the night, but the creature didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching me, mocking my futile attempt to fight it. And then the rooster, the thing, let out its final crow. The sound was deafening, more like a scream than a call, echoing through the fields, through the barn, through my bones. I knew then, there was no sunrise for me. The rooster wasn't just announcing the dawn, it was calling the end, and I wasn't getting out of that night alive. The last thing I saw, as the shadows closed in, was that monstrous figure moving toward me, the ground trembling beneath its weight, and the twisted, unnatural caw that would haunt me in the dark forever.